I love it.
Hello.
Hi. Ooh, it was fast. It's like, there's our intro. There we are. There's the faces. You guys, I am so excited for today. I've been like, this is the first live stream in a long time that I feel like I've been thinking about it at night. I've been thinking about it during the day, so I'm so excited. Michelle, thank you for joining. Michelle is an incredible clinician. She runs Anxiety Therapy LA. She has background in intensive through UCLA, and she also is famous for running the OCD Facebook group for clinicians. So I don't know if she considers that one of her claim to fame, but I do for her, because I'm like, people know her name all over for that.
I was worried about where that famous part was going to go, because there's a couple other things I'm known for. So that works.
I was going to say you're also BTTI faculty.
Oh, that's good.
BTTI
I was going to go with something.
IOCDF. Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Give me something else that you're famous for that I wouldn't know.
I was on the Kardashian show as a therapist.
I did not know that.
That's where I thought you were going with that, because that's what Eric outed me for. So
there we go. See, learn something new every day. Yeah. Look at that. Awesome. Yeah. So I'm so excited. As always, I'll do our disclaimers today. Thank y'all for joining. The live stream is intended to be educational and hopefully very supportive, and will help lead you in the right direction of getting the help that you need or providing the help that you need to your clients. But we are not intending for these live streams to replace therapy or to duplicate therapy. We hope that you have your own individual clinician that you're working with. Of course, IOCDF and or our live streams is not a crisis line or line to call if you're feeling unsafe or suicidal. Instead, we ask that you call 911 or 988, and remember, safety is your top priority. You guys, I've been thinking about this for so long for so many reasons, but I personally think that core fears are the missing treatment in most people's ERP journey, and so this came up for me a while ago. I was treating a patient. We were meeting here in my office, and I remember I was telling him, I was like, yeah, like oftentimes treatment for OCD, this was a patient who had been in treatment before, had come back, and I said, yeah, oftentimes treatment for OCD feels like this game of whack-a-mole where we're just like addressing one trigger and then another one pops up. And many times those of us who live with OCD will say things like, well, there's not even any point in me doing all the work for this thing that I'm dealing with right now, whatever my current, because it's just going to morph to something else. And so why is it worth it? And it becomes this thing where we feel really frustrated and we don't really want to do it. But what I ended up having, it was this kind of like existential crisis, or whatever you want to call it, but like I had already been doing core fear work. But what it made me realize, you guys, was that a lot of people do ERP as like a fear extinction model of like, oh, and I knew this kind of, but like it was the first time I like conceptualized it with a patient where I was like, yeah, so like we can actually do fear extinction where we can do ERP for that doorknob and make it not be triggering, and we can, right? And we all know we can do that. We can touch the doorknob and not wash our hands, and eventually it won't be triggering. But for those of us with OCD, that's exhausting. And the reason I'm so excited for today is that I feel like when a lot of people hear about or think about ERP, they think about this ERP model without core fears. And so when we hear people saying, well, like ERP is draining, it's so hard, like I do it every day and I'm like barely functioning. What I've learned is that when we actually get to know what's going on with that patient, it's because they're not addressing the core fears. They're just doing like ERP for the surface symptoms. And so they get relief, but it's momentary relief versus being able to actually address it at the core. And so I'm so excited. Like y'all think I'm a nerd, and that's totally fine. I like being a nerd, but like I really am just so excited because I think it's the missing ingredient in most people's ERP treatment. But Michelle, tell me why you're excited or what you think about core fears.
Kind of for the same reason. It's just, as the three of us have talked about, this comes up over and over and over in our Facebook group, is people asking like, how should I do an exposure for this? Or like, what will this look like? Give me, and wanting to go like really outside the box. And if we're addressing the core fears, I don't think we necessarily need to. And what comes to mind is I had a patient years ago before I learned really about like core fears and inhibitory learning. And she had like legit a 10-page hierarchy, and it could have kept going, right? Like literally everything she did from the moment she woke up to the moment she like woke up again, because even in her sleeping, there were exposures, and she just was somebody who didn't generalize. And I think it was because I didn't know to go to core fears at the time, right? It was just like, we do exposures, right? She was somebody who would eat her chips with chopsticks because she couldn't even touch the chips. And so I got her eating chips with her fingers, right? And getting into her shower without wearing flip-flops and, leaving items in her shower, but we weren't really addressing the core fears. So same thing with you, Liz, is just like that bigger movement. And that long lasting part.
Yeah. And like, I think what you're saying too is like, I think of core fears as having the ability to have this domino effect on exposures, right? So like, you don't need a 500-page hierarchy, because if we do core fears, we don't actually have to do 50 of the things on the hierarchy, because they wipe away. But Chris, tell us what your thoughts are. And you guys, I'm like so annoyed with my flyaways. I worked so hard to actually have pretty hair today.
I think of core fears as like, that is sort of like the hub, right? That is the hub that is creating it is basically convincing the client that these compulsions are necessary. So the compulsions, if you're kind of addressing like the top, you're not pulling out the root. And so when we think about core fears is where an individual can be afraid that something catastrophic might happen. They could be afraid that they might turn into someone that they don't want to be, someone unsavory, if they have like harm OCD, or maybe they have emotional contamination or sexual intrusive thoughts. Or it might be like, hey, this whole time with POCD, right? Like this whole time I want to hurt children, and I have to stop that from happening. So these compulsions don't feel like compulsions to somebody with OCD. They're basically these things that are standing in the way from something catastrophic happening or becoming, like a person becoming. And so what happens is, us as clinicians, if we're sitting there and we're kind of addressing like, hey, you shouldn't reread an email before sending it, or you shouldn't tap on your chair 3 times, that person might give into that. But as you kind of go higher in the hierarchy and you start to get to those real kind of like big compulsions someone has kept for a long time, you're almost trying to like convince them, because to them, they still feel like it's something safe. And so a lot of times I always find one of the most aha moments in treatment is when a client kind of recognizes what's underneath, and they're like, holy crap, I've never recognized that that's what's driving this whole ship.
Yeah. And I just actually had this conversation with a patient where we were talking about sensations that they were feeling, and they were like, okay, so like, I know I have to work on the sensations. I was like, yeah, but like, let's talk about what these sensations, why are they scary? And it was really much more about, because if I keep having these sensations, then I'll never feel comfortable and I'll feel anxious forever. And I was like, let's stop there. And they're like, why? And I was like, because that's actually what we have to target, right? Like, so for treatment, we've got a target that you might not feel comfortable. Like, that's the fear to target, not actually the sensations. Because if we do the sensations, it's going to morph to something else, because you're still afraid of feeling uncomfortable, right? And so it's really important to think about too with ERP. Sometimes if we're just doing surface, it's what I call it, surface ERP, sometimes we're actually feeding the OCD, because we're kind of like getting rid of that one thing, but we feel good that we got rid of it, and then it pops to something else, instead of it being that we're actually addressing what is really at the core. Okay, other thoughts and questions, because I have a million things for us to get into to try to break it down. I'm going to pull up questions people submitted.
Yeah, that's awesome. So one thing that I often teach, and I'm curious your guys' thoughts, is I feel like core fears, and I think we may have talked about this at the conference over the weekend too, is I feel like core fears sort of boil down into like 4 major things, right? Something, but you like my Halloween nails, by the way?
Over the weekend.
I love candy corn. I'm probably
the bus yet.
Yeah. Oh, I love candy corn too. So
yeah. And I taught my kid to love it too. So something bad will happen now, right? Something bad will happen in the future. I will end up alone, or I will have this feeling forever that I cannot handle. And I feel like most core fears, like we boil it down, end up with those 4. And I'm curious if you guys have thoughts on that, or if there's anything else beyond that you see.
Yeah. Did you say, sorry, I was reading there's 2 really good questions we just got. So I was like, oh, those are good questions we should answer. Did you say something about like, one that I hear is that the kind of what I said is either I'm going to become something, like if I drop my compulsions, that's irresponsible. Like I'm going to start to become lazy or clumsy or careless. Right.
Right.
And that might mean like me spreading an illness to someone or harming somebody.
Right. So in the end, something bad will happen, like in the future. Yep.
Yeah. Like I'll do something to someone, or I think sometimes one conversation we had this week at my adult support group last night is OCD can also almost kind of like convince you that who your identity is not correct. So somebody can go their whole life and be like really studious, or they can go their whole life and being really caring. But as they start to listen to the OCD more, it's like suddenly they feel like their identity is changing. Like maybe I am this whole time have been somebody that could like snap and harm people and stuff. So I think it's almost also like less, I think a lot of people, it's something happening to them, but sometimes I think it's like, I'm going to become something that I've never wanted to be. I see that with emotional contamination. Like, oh, I have a neighbor that's like harmed animals, and if I am walking and I look at that house, I will become that, right? So I hear that too.
And I'm wondering though, if that then boils down to, I will be that person and I will end up alone.
Yeah, no,
right?
Absolutely alone. I think sometimes it comes with shame. Like a lot of times, like with hit and run, it's like, okay, if I hit somebody and just kind of run and don't know it, I'm shaming my family. If I go to jail, like I'm shaming my family. So I think it's that alone and like isolated and like shame and guilt and stuff that comes in too.
Yeah. So I'm still thinking like 4 major quarters.
Yeah, I think most fit into there to some degree, right? For sure. Like there's of course always little nuances or we figure it out. But yeah, I think that I love that. And I think so my question I always say to people, first thing that comes up is people will say, how do you figure out a core fear? So if it's okay, I would love for us to just like role play that for a second. So Chris, let's pretend that if you can just pretend that you are a patient with contamination OCD and you come to the clinic to see us because your world is getting smaller, but like lots of things are contaminated. You're avoiding touching public things. You're avoiding, right? Michelle, maybe you can do like a little quick role play of getting to the core fear with Chris.
Yeah. So Chris, tell me a little bit about your obsessions.
So I had a lot of contamination, but I'll pick one. I'm really, really, really afraid of anything kind of chemical, like man-made. It can show up in the form of like a bug spray. It could be in the form of like tenting someone's house. It can be like a cologne, like anything man-made chemicals really freak me out. I think they are something I have to avoid.
Okay. And why? What would happen if you came in contact with them?
I think that it's going to get on me and I'm going to spread it. And all of the bottles always say like, you shouldn't be around this thing for a long time. So I understand spraying it, but if it blows back on me, et cetera, now I'm putting it into things like my pillows and on my bedding and my couch. And I'm going to just be laying on the couch watching TV and like inhaling these chemicals for days upon hours.
Okay. And what would happen if that were the case?
Well, I feel like over time, like inhaling those kind of chemicals will definitely lead to something medical, most likely cancer. I feel like everything, you see those commercials on TV and it's like, did you go asbestos? So I feel like it would probably lead to some kind of cancer. And I'm young at the time. I'm young and,
You're still young.
I'm afraid that cancer is going to hit me way younger. I understand I'm not happy about cancer hitting people in their 70s, like my grandparents, but to get hit with cancer in your late teens, early 20s, like that's very scary.
And what would be awful? I mean, we all know cancer's not fun, right? But what part of that would be scary or awful? Is it the actual getting the cancer? Is it that you're afraid you're going to die? What the treatment part of it? What part of cancer?
I think what really scares me is like a couple different thoughts come to mind as you speak. One is like, I've already been so isolated and like alone and like my whole life is like shrunk because of OCD. And I feel like if I got cancer, now I'd have a new thing that would kind of isolate my life and shrink it down. I also some irresponsibility. Like if I'm able to not give into if I'm able to protect myself, like why wouldn't? But I think even deeper than that, death obviously is not ideal. But for me, what it would be more so is just like a young person sick. Like looking sick, feeling sick, low energy, people needing to take care of me, like just absolutely being this like frail version of myself.
So I just want to add something before. I don't know if you want me to go farther, Liz, but I think this is a perfect example why getting to core fears is so important, is because if I initially took the like fear of cancer, a new therapist might think the person is afraid of dying. Right. And we might jump to that conclusion where it's really actually very little about the fear of dying for you in that thought process.
Yeah, no, my fear of contamination never led to death. To me, I was like, okay, if I die, then I'm done. Right. It was more so like, I'm this like sick person. People have to take care of me. They're already having to take care of me with OCD. I'm going to lose more time. I'm going to be fragile and frail. And like, here's, sorry, the word popped up and I was like,
I have to explain it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But for me, it was like, that irresponsibility, like now I'm forcing people to take care of this sick cancer person that could have stopped it. And I think just being frail and weak and all those things.
Yeah.
I love it. This was a perfect example. And I put the word "so what" because I heard that a lot. And Michelle, that's actually one of the things I always say is like, to get to your core fears, I want you to kind of respond with your first thing of like, okay, so what if that happens? So what if this happens, right? You heard Michelle say, okay, so like if that happens, then what? Okay, so let's pretend you get the chemicals on the pillows, then what, right? But that kind of like, so what, then what, until you're like, well, right? So for me, my contamination fears looked like I was afraid of getting contaminated, but it was never about me. For me, it was afraid that I would cause harm to others. So I had this fear that, well, if I get a disease that way, that means I could give it to someone else. And if I give it to someone else and then they die because of me, I couldn't live with myself, right? So it was about how could I live with the guilt and shame of causing harm to someone else? It wasn't actually about whether I got sick. I didn't care if I got sick. And so we kind of do this, so what, or like, then what? And thanks, Brendan, you can take that down anytime. But just to get to that core fear. And as Michelle said, the reason, you guys, this is so important is that if I only focused on Chris being able to not be afraid of that chemical, he might in a week be afraid of coffee and what additives might be put in that, or afraid or you were, right? And so it shifts and it morphs and this happens. But if we get to the core fear, so if Chris is no longer afraid of being frail and fragile and people having to take care of him, and he's able to tolerate, it doesn't mean he would want that, right? I want to be clear about that. We don't have to accept our worst case fears as truth or want them. No one wants that to happen. But if he is at a place where he can tolerate the distress around what if that happens, right? Which is what everyone has to be able to do. And that's an important thing. Then it actually can't morph to this. Because when you get even a thought about this coffee, you're like, who cares? Because even if I am frail, I'd figure it out, right? Or I'd have that is what's so important to recognize. And so y'all hear me talk about the biggest thing you can fight for in OCD treatment is no longer having a fear of any of your fears. If you are at a place where you're still like, oh, but I still don't want to get sick. Or when I hear people say, oh, well, I really struggled last week because one of my worst case fears, like I got triggered by it. I'm like, okay, but then that fear still has a little bit of a hold of you, right? I will give an example. Like this happened to me this week. So like I have not done specific ERP around some of my like bloodborne illness fears in a long time. And I had to get blood work done for my annual physical. And I was talking to the phlebotomist and I was like, oh, so how's business? Have you been busy? And she's like, yeah, I got a contract with the prisons. And so I'm doing all the blood work at prisons. And for me, like my OCD was just like, wait, what just happened? Right now, granted, I'm in a totally different place. So I was able to tolerate it and lean in and kind of laugh about it later. But that was something that in the past, if that fear still had total power over me, that experience would have like taken me out, for a while, so to say. And so again, but if you've done the work on the fear, it doesn't mean I still wasn't activated a little bit, right? Because I haven't had to have those sort of fears be reignited. So it still activated me a little bit, but I was able to be like, oh, that's really great. Like, I bet that keeps you really busy. Like, good for you, right? And move through it and not think much about it and move on versus, oh my gosh, versus like, imagine if I lived my life being like, oh, my bloodborne illness fears are better as long as I don't ever have to encounter the fear of a bloodborne illness again, or as long as I don't have to think about it. You're going to have to think about it. It's going to pop up in some rhyme, reason, or way, right? And so how do we get to the core fears? So that's the next question. Somebody asked if we could give a specific example of a surface ERP versus ERP that addresses the core fear. Michelle, you want to take this and give a specific example?
Yeah, I mean, I think even if we went back to Chris, like if I had just heard him saying, he was afraid of getting cancer, I might have him go hang out in the cancer unit, I used to work at UCLA, so the cancer unit at UCLA, right? Or going around and like just holding these contaminated items as opposed to really addressing that core fear of doing harm to somebody or doing harm to himself or being alone and isolated.
Well, I think additionally, Michelle, like what it allowed, my therapist to recognize and to inform me about is she said, do you see how OCD is creating your worst case fear already? Your family is taking care of you. You are frail. I was very thin because I had OCD around my food. I was like 160, which is way less when I am now at 6 foot. But it was like I was frail. My family was taking care of me. I was laying in bed all day. So the worst case scenario was already happening, but it wasn't happening from spraying chemicals because my grandma was spraying ant spray and was just fine. It was really from the OCD. And so that seems like such a duh moment. But when you're living in the OCD place, right? The OCD story is what I've always called it, is like it made sense for me to think that the biggest fear was chemicals, when in actuality, it was like I was already living my fear as well. I think another example, if I could give Liz, is like I worked with a client for an IOP, and he had been through a lot of treatment. And it was all around like checking emails before sending it, planning voicemails before sending it. And I asked him, I'm like, why does this all bother you? And he's like, well, I just can't put bad work out there. And I'm like, no, that can't be your core fear. So we spent some time. And what it really went down to is like, if I end up losing my job, my fear is that we'll become homeless. But even deeper than that was like, as a father, I feel it's my role and responsibility to provide for my family. So if I'm being careless at work, I could put my whole family in jeopardy. And that would take away like one of my biggest roles as a person, which is a father and a husband who takes care of my family. And so I was like, that's where we need to go. And his treatment actually went really quickly, because as we were doing the treatment around homelessness and being careless with family, and we did some exposures, and some response prevention, he's like, Chris, I really don't feel anxious about this anymore. And I asked why. And he said, because we have so much savings. I know I could get a new job. I don't really even think that way. I'm kind of progressive. My wife and I both kind of do 50-50. He's like, now that I've uncovered my core fear, I feel like the gas has been taken out of the engine. It's just not as strong for me. And that's what I see when you actually address a core fear. People sometimes have a like, wait, that's what I'm afraid of? Like, I can't believe this has been driving me for so long.
And so let's get a little bit into the nitty gritty, because I get this question all the time, is like, okay, but what does that actually look like in ERP, right? So like, how do you actually do both? Because I do want to be clear, if I think this coffee cup is contaminated, we're still going to touch the coffee cup, right? Like, we're not going to say, oh yeah, now you don't have to touch anything you're afraid of. Like, yeah, you still have to touch it. That's functional. That's important. You don't want to avoid. But how do you touch it and allow it to go further into the core fears? So let's just pretend, we go to some of my core fears, which is that I'm afraid that I might get a bloodborne illness. Like maybe someone had a cut, then they made this cut, right? My OCD thinks that like maybe the barista, like what if they had a cut and there's something on this coffee cup, and if I touch it, it might get on my hands and I'm going to give it to someone else and I'm going to cause someone else to get a bloodborne illness and die, right? So like I might harm someone else, is the fear of touching this coffee cup. The way I do ERP is what I call ERP plus, right? So it's ERP plus a little bit of like purposely leaning into that core fear. So you can call it, John Grayson will call it accepting uncertainty. Some people like get anxious about the word uncertainty, so you don't have to use that, whatever you want. But for me, the way it literally looks in practice would be touching this coffee cup and allowing myself to be like have the thoughts that I'm afraid of, right? So, and people will say, well, why do you have to think that thought? We're thinking it anyway. There is no one with OCD that has an intrusive thoughts and fears that when we do ERP, our mind is clear and empty. If it was, it's not ERP because it's not triggering for us, right? So I want to be very clear about that, because so many people are like, well, most people don't touch a coffee cup and purposely think they can harm someone else. And I'm like, yeah, but they're not already stuck with a million intrusive thoughts being afraid that they're going to harm someone else based on the coffee cup, right? So those thoughts are already in our head. So what we do is I touch the coffee cup and the thoughts in my head, right? What if you harm someone else? What if that's dangerous? What if you shouldn't have done that? What if that, right? Whatever it might be. And it literally, my ERP plus is being able to be like, who knows if this may or may not cause harm to someone else, or like, oh, thanks for those thoughts. Like, but I'm going to choose not to solve them and still drink this coffee and move on. I really did want some of the coffee. So, right. That is all it is. It's not this like detailed, prolific like way that we do ERP, but it's about being able to do, it's kind of, that's a lot of what ACT was when ACT started to come into ERP. It's about doing ERP, but allowing space for the thoughts that we're afraid of to be there and choosing not to respond to them, right? So tolerating the distress of those fears. And eventually, if I'm doing ERP and leaning into the core fear, it will start to have that domino effect, right? Of like, now all those other things that I was afraid of harming someone, if I've already started to tolerate the fear of harming people in an OCD lens, right? Again, it doesn't mean I walk around being like, I hope I harm someone. Of course I don't. Like, that's not the same thing. But the thoughts are already there. If I've quit responding to them, if I've quit trying to solve them, and instead I just allow space for them, then that work translates to all those other OCD triggers.
Yeah.
Michelle, if you can, I'm going to give you an example of like how core fears work for me, and maybe you can kind of like expand on it. So I, like Liz, I was petrified of getting HIV. I was like deathly afraid. And so what I did was just become celibate. I was definitely like also traditional, where it's like if I saw something red or I avoided certain things. But I would say the real way that it impacted me is like just celibate. Like I didn't have sex. I didn't engage with that. Right. And when I addressed my core fear was, if I get HIV, I'll be kind of like unlovable and like tainted, and then people won't want to be intimate or date me. Meanwhile, people didn't want to date me or be intimate because I refused that from happening because I was afraid of getting HIV. So once again, it was this like self-fulfilling prophecy. And so then, like you were saying, Liz, when it comes to values-based exposures, my therapist wasn't like, hey, you're going to go to like a HIV bank and like volunteer there and like use people as like a bait, unless you want to volunteer. But she was like, what would be like a values-based exposure? And for me, it was like just actually dating. Just like actually hanging out and like dating. And if it happens, I can be safe, but I don't have to avoid it. And that is what got me over that fear. I started dating and I started making smart choices, of course. And so how do you see that maybe being more helpful than if somebody would have just had me walking around and touching like an ATM? Because that's what some clients come to me. They're like, I have a fear of HIV. So my therapist made me touch an ATM.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I can think
ATM. Are ATMs particularly dirty?
Because they're very dirty. A lot of people
think about how many people touch them, right? It's
I know, but I've never heard that as something like I've heard like worse things of like people have me go like, touch the outside of a needle bin, which I'm like, I would never do. That's like that seems risky. But sorry, ATM. Okay.
Yeah. And I think back to, sometimes I'm a little embarrassed about the exposures I used to do when I first started at UCLA, because I totally would. We walked around having patients touch ATMs, touch like at the grocery store nearby, touch like the keypads, because we know they are really dirty. And I wouldn't say I wouldn't do that, because you still need to use an ATM. You still need to use now they have taps, so you don't need to do it. But in theory, you need to go do these things. But what was preventing you from living your life was more the dating aspect, right? And I know I've had some patients say oh, my therapist suggests I just go sleep around. No, I wouldn't do that either, because that's not necessarily in alignment with your values, right? But it's getting back into normal everyday things. And I think what your therapist was trying to hit on in that situation was that the piece that you wanted to date, it wasn't that you didn't want to date, but you thought you were protecting yourself and everybody else by not dating, and that didn't really align with your values. And so getting back into doing something that was important to you that also addressed your core fear of harming other people or ending up alone and isolated and needing to be taken care of was the perfect example.
Yeah, and it's not like touching the ATM. I was just going to go real quick. That touching the ATM isn't a bad exposure. The reason hitting the core fear is important is because I didn't think I was good. I have a mom that works at a hospital. I was very clear how you get HIV. Yep. So if a therapist would have been like, hey, we're going to touch a door handle in an ATM, those aren't bad exposures. I need to do it. But I would have had zero anxiety, and it wouldn't have felt like I was challenging my core fear. Right. My core fear was actually biting the bullet and going on a date. And so that's why I think core fear is important, is because if I have a manualized ERP model and the therapist is having me touch stuff, I'm not leaving therapy gaining anything. No knowledge, no shift, no change. But dating, that moved my life in the direction it needed to go.
Right. That's right. And I will say, if Chris had that same core fear, but he were to tell us, I'm avoiding ATMs, I'm avoiding going to the grocery store because I can't check out, we absolutely are going to go touch those things, right? Mm-hmm. And we're going to touch them while leaning into the core fears. We're not going to just touch an ATM so that one ATM at that certain location in LA isn't triggering to Chris. We're going to touch the ATM and be like, my brain is telling me that 1 million people touch this, and it might be contaminated with all sorts of things, including diseases, but I'm going to tolerate that and move forward anyway, right? That is how you do that exposure and lean into that core fear. And now all of a sudden, all ATMs become not so scary. I do want to say, you might still think ATMs are dirty. Like, that's
They
okay.
are.
I'm very clear about that, right? Like, some people will have this fear of pumping gas and they're like, well, pumping gas is dirty. And I'm like, yeah, it is dirty, but it's not dangerous. And those are two different things, right? What is your OCD telling you? So let's get back for a second, because here's one thing I want to throw at people. And I think when I say this, sometimes people are like, Liz, like, that resonates, and what are you saying? But it's important. I was at a place in my life, in my treatment, for probably 10 or 15 years, where therapy every week was putting out fires. It was literally like, well, I saw a condom wrapper in Walgreens last week in the parking lot. So now these shoes are contaminated and my house is contaminated and all the shelf is contaminated. So like, I can't tolerate it. I can't live. I've just been waiting to see you to talk about it. And I'm totally dysfunctional. It's miserable. The next week, well, I opened the door at Local Foods. And when I did, I saw something red. So what if it was blood? And now everything's contaminated. I tried to clean, but I'm right. And it was just like, every week we were putting out what I would call crisis of the week, right? But OCD crisis of the week. That, you guys, is indicative that you haven't done your core fear work. If when you show up in therapy every week, so as a therapist, I want you listening to me. If your patients are showing up and every week you are doing crisis management of the current OCD crisis of the week, so to say, we have not done the core fear work. Yeah. That is when y'all hear me saying we're doing ERP to function. What we're doing is we're doing enough ERP every week. I'm holding on. I'm doing enough to be able to survive. And I'm surviving by white knuckling and struggling my way through it until I can get more support. And like, if that is what therapy is like, then yeah, that's why the misconceptions of ERP are perpetuated. The misconceptions that ERP is awful. It's excruciating. It's painful. Because that is not full ERP.
I call that just coming to session and vomiting.
Yeah. It's ERP to function.
Yeah.
When we do core fear work, we can actually get to freedom. And we can get to a place where when I go to therapy, you guys, yeah, I'll probably still say like, oh yeah, I got blood work and it was triggering, and like, or here's a trigger that came up, but like, yeah, but haven't even thought about it since. I might mention it because it's like an interest. But at this point, we're talking about all sorts of stuff. Family dynamics, how to set boundaries, kids, right? All these other things. And if OCD comes up, I might talk about how I worked through it or what I would have wanted to do different or how I can set boundaries, but we're not talking about these significant OCD triggers and help get me out of it right now today. If you're doing that, you're kind of doing this standard ERP, right? You're like using ERP to function. I want you to use ERP to get you to freedom. There's a huge difference in functioning with OCD where we're struggling, but we're functioning. That's not what we're fighting for. And I really do think core fear work is the difference. It's literally the difference in being able to live freely versus surviving and functioning with severe OCD.
Yeah. Well, I think that, we have like 60,000 thoughts a day, right? And we give so much weight to these thoughts, OCD thoughts, right? I don't even call them OCD thoughts in my practice, but OCD thoughts. And I always tell my clients, if I have the thought, I feel like some chocolate ice cream right now, I'm not going to be like, why am I thinking about chocolate ice cream? It's 9:30 in California. That doesn't make any sense. What does that say about me, right? But if I have the thought, oh my God, what if I just pick up this knife and like throw it at Chris right now? We're not even in the same room, but I'm going to be like, why did I have that thought? What does that say about me? Am I a bad person, right? And so it's the weight we give to these thoughts. You're going to always have thoughts, all thoughts, what we consider good thoughts, bad thoughts, and neutral thoughts, right? And so as Liz was talking about, she's still having thoughts when she goes to get blood taken, right? But it's not as sticky. She can work through it. And that's because of the core work she did.
What I think also when you were talking about freedom, Liz, I think the reason addressing core fears is so important is like when, I really thought about it, I was busting my butt. Everything about me at the time was busting my butt to get better so that I could get independent, so that my family didn't have to take care of me anymore. My dad was like cooking my food, cutting it up and feeding me. And I was so embarrassed, right? And so no wonder OCD was attacking this core fear of like, you're going to never be independent. You're going to be at home. You're going to be withering away. And so I would say like addressing the core fear, there's always this kind of controversy, like, oh, you have to spend the whole life not knowing who you are or something with ERP, which I feel is just not accurate for me, like as I was doing the work and getting better and addressing core fears, we had those conversations in therapy, and it was like, Chris, do you see how it's ridiculous almost that OCD is trying to tell you that you're trying to be irresponsible and be taken care of? Like everything about you, your motivation to come every week and every session and do the work and bust your butt is because you're yelling from the rooftops that you want to be independent, you want to take care of yourself, you want to move out, and you want to move on. Who OCD is saying is not who you really are. I always tell my clients, like when they talk about themselves, it feels like it's their political opponent running like an ad on TV, like destroying them. And I'm like, you're such a strong person. You care so much about children, right? Like in my head, I'm thinking you're the opposite of that. And I think that's what core work does as well, is it sheds away the person that OCD has conned you into believing you are for so long, and your true self kind of comes up. And I was able to see, like with my harm OCD, I'm like, how in the world did I let OCD trick me that I would ever hurt the women in my family? I'm Greek. I will like go to the death to protect my family.
You always say, Chris, you always say I'm Greek as if like only Greek people protect their family. I feel like I've heard you say it so many times lately, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not Greek.
Have you not seen my big fat Greek wedding?
No, I know, but you're always like, I'm Greek, so food is important. I'm Greek, so, and I'm like, hey, food's important
Greek
to me.
People, we're obnoxious. I'm Norwegian too, and we're not obnoxious on that side. So my Greek ancestors get the obnoxious. But like for me, like I was raised like you're the boy in the family, you protect your sisters, like all of that. And so I remember as I was going through and working on core work fear for my harm OCD, I remember having those conversations with my therapist about how ridiculous I ever was conned into believing I'd hurt people when my very essence was the opposite. And so I think that's what core work does as well, is like your true self. You're like, oh, I reconnect with who I am. And that's when we have these talks about people saying, like Ethan does it a lot, like life after OCD, you almost have to recognize who you really are, because OCD had you like start to almost not believe your own identity. And I think that's important work.
Let's hop to the question from Kitty Kate at 11:14 my time. It says, with all OCD themes, do we have to address the possibility of it coming true? I've seen so many different opinions on this and so many advocates say so, but it's super hard for me. I love this. And I have a lot of thoughts, but I'm going to let Michelle take this one.
Wait, I have to reread it. I think there are so many different ways to approach. I don't think there's one right way, right? Some therapists will say you can take a maybe, maybe not approach. The reality is when we're fighting OCD, we have to tolerate, and I know I'm going to get so much flack for this, is like there's some uncertainty we have to accept, right? Is that do you have to accept you're going to be a pedophile? No, you're not going to be a pedophile, right? Like we know that. But it's the core fear that we're accepting, right? Like, could you end up alone? Maybe, but we don't need to sit here and have this whole conversation of it could come true, right? For some people, the uncertainty is more the anxiety than saying like this could come true, right? As part of the exposure. So,
and we've actually done talks on this, on the fact that you do not have to accept your worst case fear as truth. But what that doesn't mean is that we have to make sure we're certain about it, right? I think those are two different things. So I've had fears of pedophilia OCD since I was a child. That was a huge theme for me. I am not a pedophile. I feel confident in knowing that. I can say that with 100% full confidence. And OCD treatment allowed me to say that confidently. Before I had OCD treatment, I would say to you, well, what if I am? Well, I'm not totally sure. I don't know, right? Like it's a doubting disease. I doubted it. And so ERP for me, did that mean it meant I had to say, oh, I might be a pedophile? No, I didn't need to lean into being a pedophile. Like I'm not. And if you told me I had to, I'd be like, I don't want to do this treatment. Like, peace out, right? But instead, it was about being able to say, what are the things that your OCD stopping you from doing? Oh, being around your niece, being around your child, changing their diaper, all these things. How do we get you to start doing those, right? That's the exposure. And the core fear work for me was when I had thoughts come up of, well, what if you want to look at them? What if you are a pedophile, right? Whatever they were, being able to say, I'm going to choose not to figure that out and move on. So I was leaving those triggering thoughts unanswered. And that is what we mean by the core fear work, right? You do the exposures, and when the triggers and thoughts come up, you choose to leave them unanswered, right? You choose to let the core fear be there, be unanswered, and it will start to dissolve. But the second we start going into, I want to solve it, I want to do compulsions to feel better, we get more stuck in the fear. and the fear has more control over us. But if we quit answering to it, right, we just let it be there and like, okay, like, and we respond as if the fear doesn't scare us, like, oh, okay, there's that shitty thought, or there's that thought, like, not going to do anything about it. We let it come and go. It doesn't have power over us. And so that's the beauty that's there. But this goes specifically into a question that we got, a pre-submitted question, or another question that I love that I want to talk about. So I had somebody who was doing perfectionism OCD work, and they said, you know, my previous therapist would have me for ERP purposely make mistakes, and they wanted me to purposely make mistakes on homework and turn it in, and I wasn't willing to do it because for me, like, I want to make good grades. I don't want to make mistakes, and like I didn't see the value or importance in purposely making a mistake on a paper and turning it in and getting a bad grade. Like, yeah, I guess I could learn that if I get a bad grade, it's not that big of a deal, but like, I don't know why I'd have to do that. I don't want to do that. And my answer was like, well, actually, you don't need to do that for ERP. You don't need to purposely do something that goes against what you want. But then it was like, well, what do I do? So Chris, why don't you take that and help walk through what ERP with core fear work could actually look like for that trigger?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned perfectionism, because one thing that that's something I've struggled with. And when I really sit there and talk to my clients that have perfectionism OCD, it is usually connected to something deeper, and why core fear work is really great. And so when I've talked to clients, a lot of times they might say, look, I'm afraid of disappointing my parents. My parents put a lot of pressure on me, and I feel like if I don't do perfect, that's going to reflect like failure on family, right? Or sometimes the core fear is more so tied with identity, like who I am is based on these grades. And I like to take, if somebody like that client is not willing to do something like that, I like to take a strong response prevention model. So I would say to them, I have a client I'm working with right now who does about 7 hours of homework. So we found out from the teachers how much homework they're supposed to be doing each evening. And we've worked on that kind of structure. And then she comes in. Real quick side note, I don't know if you feel this way, Liz. I think sometimes, not Michelle, of course, I think sometimes therapists think that they have to go over the top for people with OCD. And I'm like, having OCD, the littlest things can trigger the heck out of us. We don't need to do big things. So for her, we didn't need to purposely mess up her grades and turn it in poorly, because just going from 7 hours, and we did it in a systematic way, to the teacher was like, all she's supposed to be doing is an hour and a half. So we're at 2 hours right now. It's like just doing 2 hours of homework is freaking her out and addressing the fear enough. But because she knows her teacher is the one that said it, she knows that she's doing too much, she's tired of not seeing friends and playing with her brother, she's like, you know what? I'll do this. And that's where the motivation came in, is because it was something that she felt was worthwhile. And meanwhile, we're working on that kind of like made up belief that if she does bad grades, she's a failure at life. Her family is like, we don't even think that, right? So it's kind of addressing all this underneath stuff. Whereas if we would have just like turned in grades wrong, A, she probably wouldn't do that either. But B, it's like she would have just been mad at me. Like, I don't think she would have found value in that kind of work.
So let's talk about, what do you do? So what do you do? Like, do you have to make a mistake? But also my question would be to you guys is the fear of getting a bad grade the core fear? Like, what do you think? Michelle, take it from here.
No, before I answer that, I want to go back real quick to what you're talking about in terms of the pedophilia. Is if a client is having those thoughts, I want them to get to the point where they're not treating it any different than, oh my God, I want chocolate ice cream right now. Right.
So, or I'm going to win the lotto.
Right. Exactly.
Good thing. Yeah.
Exactly. So I oftentimes feel with perfectionism, it's not about the grade. It's the judgment. Like my teachers will not respect me, or they will think I don't respect them. Right. It's things like that, or the what gets tied to it a lot is I'll be lazy. And if I'm lazy in this instance, it'll sort of spread to everything, and I will just become this lazy loaf that does nothing. And which will then trickle to, I will end up alone, because if I'm lazy, then I can't get a job. I won't graduate college. I can't get a job. I will have no money, and I will end up on the streets. Right. And it ends up there. So I find that that's the case. Sometimes I do exposures where they can't answer every question. And this is all working with their teacher or professor, right? It's like the point of homework. Look, research even shows that homework is not helpful, but is with homework is maybe even only doing every other question, right? So that they're practicing the concepts, but they're leaving stuff blank. That's one of the ones I often do. So that's just one example.
Yeah. And I just want to say, so I just want to throw out there, you don't need, so actually, just so everyone knows, the way this came about is the person I was talking to, they were like, yeah, so like my son no longer wants to do ERP and we're looking for a different therapy method. And that's why I was like, well, why? What happened? And then they told me, and I'm like, oh, well, it's not that they don't want to do ERP. It's that they don't want to do ERP if it means they have to make mistakes, which isn't values-based for them, right? If you told me as a Christian that I needed to write something blasphemous in my Bible to address my scrupulosity, I'd be like, not interested in that. Like, no, thank you. Not going to do ERP with you. And so I say this because I think it's really important for us to like demystify what people think ERP is. And for us as clinicians to understand, we actually don't need to do that to get to the core fear. So we've done a ton of work around social. So let's answer that really quick. So for example, for me, yeah, like Chris said, it might be about actually like doing your homework, saying, what would you do if you didn't have OCD? Oh, I would do my homework once and do a quick check. Okay, then that's the limit we're going to set. We're going to set that as the limit, and that's what you're going to do. But then afterwards, when you start having intrusive thoughts of, well, what if I made a mistake? What if I need to check it again? That's when we're going to tolerate, like, I might have, but I'm going to choose to let that be so that I can go eat dinner with my family now, because that's more important, right? So that is how you do the ERP. You set your ERP limits, but then you lean into the core fears is after. When OCD throws these thoughts at you, are you able to lean into tolerating them and move forward versus getting stuck answering them, which leads back to compulsions? I don't know what my next thought was going to be, so we're going to move on because this happens to me a lot. So Chris, let's throw the next one at you from Chantel at 11:21. I love this chat. Thank you, Chantel. Should we be doing ERP on core fears and themes? I've been trying to jump between exposures and it seems to be helping. Chris, you're really hitting home with core fears.
Yes. Okay, I found the question. Should we do ERP on core fears and themes? Yeah, I mean, the reason that we wanted to put this talk together for y'all today is because if you are working with a clinician and you're only feeling like you're addressing the surface stuff, and the two things we always hear and how you know you're only addressing surface stuff is either it keeps jumping themes, or you find out that, you know, you beat something, a trigger, and a new trigger pops up, right? So the way that you know you're not addressing core fears is those are happening. So as we work in therapy, the other great thing that happens is you might have 10, 15, 30 things in your hierarchy, but you start to recognize that they all fall down to the same core fear. So if you work on exposures around that, that is going to be the thing that gets better. So for me, my exposures were, you know, let's say like around harming my family, right? Like my fear was that I was going to harm my family, etc. I can do exposures around like being around my grandma, but if I was really addressing the core, which is like, what if I just kind of like snap and stuff like that? What it helped me do is like prove almost through ERP that nothing wrong was happening. So what I think part two of ERP though that comes in to address your question, Chantel, is like you should be starting to learn like what Michelle just said is like the mechanics of OCD, because we focus on themes and we focus on subtypes in the beginning because we have to find exposures that address those. But after a while, you should be focusing on the mechanics. Like, how am I getting fooled by OCD? What emotions do I experience with emotional reasoning that trick me into giving in? Because once you start to learn the mechanics of it, it doesn't matter if OCD tells you you're going to hurt somebody. It doesn't matter if you're being blasphemous. You start to look at what's underneath, and so then like content and like subtype stops to matter after a while. That's kind of like what I think is part two. I don't know if you guys agree with me, but once clients start to like address core fears and address themes and get better from that, I'm like, I don't want it to move to something else. So did you see how OCD gave you doubt? You fell for it. You gave in. Like, how else could it affect you and how else would you address it? And I feel like clients then come back later and are like, thank you for doing that, because a new theme popped up when I went off to college. And I find now like I didn't fall for it because it felt just like the other theme, but just on something different.
Totally. And I'm going to bring us back. By the way, please visit one of our webinars that we've done with Lauren Wadsworth and others on social justice-based ERP, because I thought it did a really good job of addressing core fears and what that might look like, but how exposures can be very different. And so I'll give an example, but we had a patient once who had a fear of saying racial slurs, and previous therapy was writing out racial slurs. Like literally she would write them out. And that's what people did 10, 15 years ago or longer, right? We don't do that anymore. I would not write a racial slur. I would not be okay with that. I wouldn't do that with my clients. So why am I asking them to do it, right? I shouldn't be asking you to do something I'm not willing to do. And the reality is that patient didn't need to do that. For them, actually a bigger trigger was they said, like, I've been avoiding my friends of color. I've been avoiding being able to just have conversations. I've been avoiding everything because I'm so afraid I'm going to say a racial slur. That for them, the bigger exposure was going to lunch with their friends and having conversation, right? That was the exposure because they had been avoiding it. And then the core fear work was afterwards when they started having thoughts of, did I say something inappropriate? Did I accidentally say a racial slur? Did I say anything offensive? Being able to be like, I'm going to choose not to figure that out and move on. And I'm just so excited I got to eat lunch with my friends, right? That is doing ERP and leaning into the core fear, right? So that's what it can look like. I love the next question. I want to throw it, and I'm happy to answer it because I love this one. But Phyllis Taylor at 1125 said, my core fear is hell and eternal suffering. How can this fear be addressed? This is such a good question. Any of y'all want to take it? If not, I'm happy to.
I'm only laughing because I'll let you take it, but I just want to share, like, talking about like pre-exposure and now what we do is, like, I remember having a patient fearing that, and we like drew pictures of hell and we like had her imagine that she was in hell, right? It's so not necessary. And I just,
why do we do that?
No, I don't know. Thank God we've learned.
So here's the funniest thing. So Phyllis, when I have patients with this fear, I'll say, so what's your true core fear? Right? And often it might be going to hell, but it often might also be that I might not go to heaven. And so I always say, can we take a positive spin on exposures? And for these patients, some of the best exposures are saying things like, I'm really excited to be able to go to heaven. Like, I believe in my faith and can't wait to be in heaven one day. And the patients with this fear will be like, oh my gosh, but that's even more triggering. And I'm like, yeah, because your OCD is already throwing at you that you might not. And so how about instead we lean into like, man, like, I can't wait to be in heaven one day and see my relatives that I know are there. And then when OCD says, well, what if not? What if you're going to go to hell? It's like, I can't figure that out, but I'm really holding on to what my faith tells me and what I believe.
And what if I want chocolate ice cream right now?
Yeah. And what a better values-based exposure, right? And actually those become more triggering, right? Kind of like that. I don't need to go write racial slurs, but instead I need to go have lunch with my friends who I've been missing and avoiding and lean into the uncertainty that might come up around being with them, right? And having lunch. And so think about it in that aspect. Chris, the next question will throw to you from CNMA at 1125. Great question. I struggle with suppressing the intrusive thought to a level of disassociating. It's like I'm forcing the thought to not be able to speak. How can I balance it? Cut off, but it makes OCD trying to shout louder.
Yeah, when I would say CNMA, this is probably like one of the biggest things people do prior to treatment. Nobody likes, I would say with OCD, it's both the content of the thought, but it's that emotional experience that we get with it. We get those like stress hormones, we get the panic feeling, et cetera, which gives us then the misreading that this must be true or this must be important. So what everybody does is they try to suppress it. They try to push it away. They try to avoid it. But the problem that happens is what we resist persists. And so the more that we push it away, the louder it comes back to us. So one of the biggest parts of OCD treatment that some people, I would say people beginning out in this field might not always address is like the mental compulsions, right? Because we can't see those compulsions, but trying to suppress and push away thoughts is a mental compulsion. And what you're finding is it's just getting louder, because basically what you're telling your brain is like, this bad thing, push it away, but be on the lookout, because if it comes back, we got to push it out again. So all day you're scanning and waiting for that thought, and you're afraid of just having that thought. It is really hard with this treatment, but it's so necessary to allow the thoughts be present. Like Liz was saying, we're not saying that you let the thought be present and say, I am this is who I am. Oh my God, this is happening. I'm going to going back to Phyllis, like I'm going to go eternal hell. It's like, no, I have a disorder that gives me thoughts that really, really rile me up. What if I just invited it in? What if I said, hey, come hang out with me. You're going to be here anyways. You might as well sit down and get comfortable. You take the power away from it. So clients think I'm crazy when they're like, well, what did you do about your harm thoughts? And I was like, if it was 8 a.m. and I'm eating breakfast and I didn't have a harm thought yet, I was like, OCD, you're slacking. Where are you? Aren't I supposed to kill someone today? Like, where are you? And when you just treat it so nonchalant, like I want ice cream, you don't give that thought any more attention. Pretty soon you feel like a thought is a thought. And then when it presents itself, it doesn't come with that emotional backing. And pretty soon the thought kind of goes and floats. Lastly, shout out to mindfulness. That was a really big part of my treatment. I learned to just coexist with thoughts and not feel the need to constantly do something about that. And we see that in acceptance and commitment therapy as well.
Well, and can't we just freaking recognize what you just said, Chris, which is like, the more we welcome the thoughts, the message that we're sending is that we're not afraid of you. But the second we start suppressing the thought, disassociating with it, trying to make sure we don't have it, saying, okay, I'll be okay as long as I don't hear that on the news or my friend doesn't talk about that. All those messages we're sending is that our thought is dangerous. Our thought is scary. We can't have it. We can't tolerate it. So again, so much of this work, including core fear work, is, are you sending the message to your fears, to your anxiety, that I'm not afraid of you?
Real quick,
changing our relationship with the thoughts.
Yeah, I was just going to add to what you were saying. I was going to add to what you're saying too, Liz, is like, then people hear, oh my God, but does that mean I like it? And it's like, having something be present without resisting doesn't mean that you like it. If you go out to Disneyland with your friends and somebody brings their boyfriend who you can't see, being there with them doesn't suddenly mean you like them. It just simply means like, look, I don't want to cause conflict. I'm going to coexist with this person and address my attention to the friends I actually want to be there with. So the opposite of, the only other two things you can do then is like try to push it away or hyper analyze it. And we know both of those things make it worse. So what if you're just kind of like, dude, here's my morning 8 a.m. I'm going to hurt everybody thought. All right, cool. And go to eat your breakfast. Like, you've given it that much attention, and that's your power, is deciding, like Michelle just said, changing your relationship with the thoughts.
Yeah. And I don't know about you, but like, have you ever been in the room with a toddler? We have to like change their relationship
every day.
And it's like, okay, so like, are we going to keep worrying about that? Or are we going to do that? And my daughter is in this phase, you guys, where she only wants to wear one pair of rainbow shoes. And I'm like, we're not wearing the same shoes every day. Like, they're beat up. You're not wearing those, Olivia. And so it's like, I finally told her today, I'm like, listen, you are wearing the shoes mom or dad pick out for you in the morning. And you can choose to fight it all morning and ruin an hour, or you can just tolerate being okay with it and move on. And guess what? When you choose option B, after about 2 minutes, you forget about the shoes and you move on. OCD is not that much different, you guys, right? But the more we try to like, I'll wear these shoes, but I keep thinking about them and I wish I didn't have them. And why does mom have them on me, right? You're going to keep worrying about the shoes. It's going to be a bigger deal versus being like, I don't like these shoes. I'm mad I have to wear them, but that's what's happening today anyways, and I'm going to move on. You forget about them pretty quick. So core fears are critical. They're so important. And what I have found is that if you feel stuck in treatment, if you feel like you're plateauing, if you feel like you're not getting the freedom you deserve, it may be because you haven't done the core fear work. If you find that there are still things that you are deeply afraid of and that OCD would stick, even my example, when I did that blood work this week, yes, I walked through it, you guys, and moved through it, no problem. I shouldn't say no problem. It was a little triggering. But it also was an indicator for me of like, you know what, Liz, you should up some of that core fear work a little bit so that you don't even have it stick at all. Because if it's sticking at all, there's still some work to be done at the core because it's still triggering. It's still anxiety provoking. And core fear work gets you freedom from OCD so that you don't have to live your life figuring out how to function with your diagnosis. Michelle?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I was thinking about this morning, my toddler yelling at me for 10 minutes. Either he was hungry and needed to eat right then, except it wasn't time to eat yet, or I needed to come back to his room with him because he didn't want to be alone in his room to lay down. And I just didn't engage with it. I just kept sort of repeating what I normally repeat. And within a few minutes, he stopped and just like then started laughing and like telling me stories and all the things. So it's just like, if we don't engage with our OCD like that, the same thing happens.
Yeah, I just want to shout out Emily Salo's comment. I feel like she gets it, right? She says she just had this combo with a client. Allowing thoughts of pedophilia does not mean you're endorsing pedophilia. You're just not choosing to engage and figure it out in the interest of doing what matters to you and playing with your niece. Yeah, that was the talk that we did with Emily Bailey and Callie Warner and Liz and I, is like, we really wanted to get people to understand that the treatment is not to accept that you are something, right? We have these thoughts. And like Michelle started this conversation out, we have so many thoughts a day. The problem with OCD is we take an extra special kind of like awareness to that thought. And we think that by trying to figure it out and getting answers is going to be the thing that makes it go away. But that's just what keeps you stuck. So when you acknowledge the presence of a thought, even if it's unwanted, and you simply let it kind of like fade out organically on its own, but choose to instead do the opposite, engaging with your niece or whatever it is, that's when the thoughts are deemed kind of useless. Somebody had asked earlier, Talon asked, is like exposure scripts are out now. We had this conversation at our talk at the conference. For me personally, I just use them different. I don't think that there's something we should throw them out. A lot of times clients come in, they don't know their core fears. And so one of the first things I want us to do is figure out the core fear. I'll hand them a piece of paper and I'll say, let's just see, what would OCD say if tomorrow you stopped rereading your emails? And that's that client I was giving an example earlier. As we were writing it out to OCD's worst case scenario, he's like, oh my God, it's both that we'll become homeless and then I won't have my role as a father. I didn't realize that's what was driving the whole ship. Instead of having him then reread that and reread that and reread that, we did in like real life exposures that kind of addressed his values, a lot of response prevention. So I use them, but I use them more as like an insight and educational and a fact-finding mission. So I think it just depends on the clinician. But I definitely wanted to shout out Emily's comment because I think that's what the three of us are trying to get clinicians to recognize. And Emily really understands that. So thanks, Emily.
I love it so much. I think this has been so great, and I'm so excited to share this. And I just want us to remember core fear work is critical. If you feel like the work that you're doing is like getting at the surface, but you have to keep getting at the surface and there's just so much left underneath, you need to be thinking about that. When I hear people call me saying, well, ERP's worked and it's got me better, but like it gets me better, then I struggle again in a year, then I struggle again in a year. I'm like, you haven't done what's at the core, right? Because if you have, you should get freedom across the board. So keep fighting for that. Ask questions to your clinicians. And if you're a clinician and you have questions about how to do this work, reach out, consider IOCDF.org. And they have consulting groups and lots of options, but make sure you're doing that core fear work because without it, OCD will keep sticking around. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for hanging with us, Michelle.
Thanks for having me, guys. I love it.
Michelle. Thank you.
And Carrie asked about a book. We got to write a book on this.
Oh, yes.
Let's do it. Oh, yay.
Carrie, there's no book that I can recommend yet, but we will write a book. And you'll be the first one to get us.
Great, yes. And like Chris, why don't you give us a deadline too while we're on here?
December 31st. Let's go.
Let's go. Let's go. Not like we have anything to do. Y'all crack me up. I actually think we should.